Good morning, everyone. To mark World Food Safety Day on the 7th of June, this special edition Breakfast Bite is on how to manage food safety in your business. I'm Emma and I'll be your host for the event this morning. And as we all know, food safety is a shared responsibility and everyone has a role to play from farm to table to ensure the food we consume is safe and healthy. So through World Food Safety Day, the World Health Organization works to mainstream food safety in the public agenda and reduce the burden of foodborne diseases globally. The day reminds us all that food safety is everyone's business. With this in mind, I'm joined here by my colleague, Dr. Lisa O'Connor. And Lisa is a Chief Specialist in Biological Safety and will present the talk this morning. And behind the scenes, we have Elaine, Mary and Jane, and they're working away to make sure everything runs smoothly for us. So we're delighted you're here online with us. The event this morning will last 40 minutes in total, 30 minutes for presentation, followed by 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. And if you do have any questions for Lisa, you can pop them in the chat box on your screen and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. So we've uploaded some documents that you might find useful after the event, and you'll notice these in the handout section on your screen, and they can be downloaded if you like. And in addition to this, we'll email you with all of the resources mentioned later on this afternoon. And lastly, if you're on social media, please let us know at #FSAI events. And now I'll hand you over to Lisa. Enjoy.
Thanks, Emma. Just checking everybody can hear me okay. You can hear me, Emma? Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Great. So just to get started, so as Emma said, we're doing this event as one of a number of activities FSAI is doing to mark World Food Safety Day, which is a day organised by the World Health Organization. And the theme really is a call to action for all of us to play our role in making sure food is safe. And you can see from this slide that it's a farm to fork approach, and not just including businesses and farmers, but also government officials like ourselves and the consumers. So everybody has a role to play in ensuring that the food that eventually gets consumed is safe. I suppose another background to this talk is the gradual reopening of the hospitality sector, which we're all thrilled to be seeing. So we're conscious that a number of you may be either changing from a takeaway mode to back to maybe going back to full service in a few weeks' time. So we thought it would be useful to sort of refresh your minds on, for those of you who are new to food businesses, sorry, to those of you who have existing food businesses, to refresh your minds on what's important in food safety management systems. And then some of the audience, of course, may be entirely new and may be thinking of starting a food business. So we'll have some tips for you as well as we go along. So to get started with the talk, I'll cover two main topics: what food safety hazards need to be managed, and then how do we manage them. And then I will say a few words on what's new. So we broadly in food safety think about three main food hazards: biological hazards such as harmful bacteria that you might find in raw meat; chemical hazards, an example might be leaching of chemicals from unsuitable packaging materials. So for example, certain materials are suitable for use with hot foods, and they're designed such that the chemicals, in those packaging won't leach into the food when exposed to a hot temperature. So these are the kind of things you need to think about when you're choosing your packaging. Make sure you have the right packaging for the right foods. And then physical contamination, I think everybody is aware of this. Glass or metal can easily get into food. And that's something that businesses are constantly trying to make sure doesn't happen. I'm going to pause now and sort of give the controls over to you just for a minute with an audience poll. And I just want to ask you, how do you treat allergens as a fourth hazard category when you're doing your hazard analysis? Do you treat it as a fourth category or not? If you don't really understand the question, please answer not sure. Okay, so we'll just take a few minutes, a few seconds rather with this. Okay, and then maybe Emma, have we progressed enough? Have enough people answered at this stage?
Yeah, so we 79% say yes, 5% no, and 16% not sure.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised. Some people may be not sure about this question. So really the answer is it's up to you, whatever works for your food business. So while allergens are considered to be a chemical hazard, many businesses do in fact choose to treat them as a fourth hazard because they are quite different in terms of how they happen and in terms of how you control them. So I'm just going to say a few more words about food allergens. Many of you will be aware that there are 14 allergens that are considered the most common allergens in Europe that are included in a list that must be labelled on food packaging, but actually information on them must also be provided to customers to whom you serve or sell loose foods. So, you know, principally you need to think about those 14 allergens, but then additionally, the other thing you need to think about is that your customers may be allergic to any food, and the truth is people can be allergic to anything. I remember at a seminar on allergens a few years ago, a girl who was allergic to beef, you know, never heard of it before. So bear in mind, people can actually be allergic to anything. So the thing you need to consider in your own food safety management system is if somebody asks you about a food that's not one of the 14 that you may have more controls in place for, whatever you do, don't guess. If somebody's allergic to something, they can't. They need to rely on you to tell them if it is or isn't in the food. So we just caution you not to guess. Okay, so moving on into what are the main elements of how you go about controlling food safety hazards. You do that by having a food safety management system with the following elements. Good hygienic practice. It's not unsurprising that hygiene is going to be a core element of this. I've put a number of abbreviations in here, which you'll find in some of the documents that Emma mentioned. So good hygienic practice is probably the term most people are familiar with. Prerequisite programs has crept in the last number of years. And then the other element, the key element to sort of drilling in and finding the most vulnerable parts of your food safety management system is this having procedures based on the principles of hazard analysis and critical control point. So in the next two slides, I'm going to describe these two topics in a little bit more detail. Personally, I think it's useful to think of hygiene in terms of three main areas when you're setting up your system. First of all, you need to decide where you're going to operate. So if you're a market stall, do you have the appropriate protection to protect from bird droppings that might be flying overhead? If you're doing a large manufacturing business, do you have an appropriate layout, appropriate materials on the walls for cleaning, appropriate layout in terms of staff moving from clean areas back to dirty areas, but not going back, not going from a dirty area to a clean area or a high risk area. So structural hygiene is obviously a key element of hygiene. The next is about the people. So making sure that people understand good hygiene in terms of not touching their face and then handling food. I suppose one thing we'll say is that people use gloves quite a lot, and for sure that can help, but gloves used badly can be just as bad as unclean hands. So the principle is that people should understand they need to be using clean hands. The other thing people need to be trained on and understand is that if they have gastrointestinal symptoms or if they have an open wound on a hand, they need to take action. So if they have an open wound, maybe they cover it, but maybe it's not appropriate for them to work with food, or they cover it with a plaster and then with gloves. And if they are sick, that they absolutely can't work with food. I realize this is a challenge for a sector where people aren't paid very highly and possibly also not paid for sick leave. But we're all more conscious in this pandemic about our actions when we are carrying infection have implications for other people. Okay, and then the third element is the how. So for example, making sure you prevent cross-contamination between raw and ready-to-eat foods, making sure you store chilled foods at refrigeration temperatures, and it is a legal requirement to maintain the food chain. So those are the three main elements. So moving on to the Hassub principles, for those of you maybe who are less familiar with it, I'm going to take the example of cooking a beef burger and just looking specifically at the step. So the first principle is hazard analysis. So for us in Ireland, we're conscious that beef, about 3% of minced beef on a retail survey a number of years ago was found to be contaminated with this organism called E. coli 157 and similar types of toxin producing E. coli. So we really want to get rid of that. And in this example as well, I mean, many people will be aware that it's fine to eat rare steak, but there's a huge difference between a steak and a burger. On a steak, the contamination is only on the outside because the muscle is intact. With a minced beef burger, the contamination is throughout the burger. So what's important is certainly cooking. Cooking is a step that will kill these microorganisms. And what's really important is to make sure that we cook the product thoroughly, even to the core. So unlike a rare steak where you can just sear the surface and destroy any contamination that's going to be present, with a minced piece of meat, you have to ensure that the temperature in the core is at least 75 degrees or an equivalent time temperature combination. So you could cook for longer at a lower temperature, and we have guidance available in FSAI for how you would do that. So the fourth principle of Hassub is monitoring. So periodically you need to check that the correct temperature has been reached. And I'm just going to mention here that the legislation around this is flexible, and I'll go into flexibility in a bit more detail later. But for example, in a catering establishment, periodic monitoring of the beef burger might be at the start of a shift where you've a set size, you start the day and you have typically a particular size of burger that's been produced. You have a chef starting on the shift, and that they get into cooking that burger and then seeing, typically how long that took to reach the right temperature. If you were in a large manufacturing plant, it would be expected that you would check that the temperature of a cooked product was reached for every batch. It wouldn't be. It would be much more frequent checking. Then it's important to know what you're going to do if something goes wrong. And in this case, it's relatively simple. You cook for longer. And then the sixth principle is that you verify. So that's not just the monitoring. Some people tend to confuse monitoring and verification. Verification is then a manager periodically checking that staff are actually doing the monitoring and taking the corrective actions. And then finally, you have to keep documentation in relation to this. So you have to keep your records up to date, and you have to make sure that the plan you have in place that's identified how the monitoring you should do, the frequency, and who should do it, corrective action to take place, that all of that is up to date. And just before I move on, I suppose I'm just going to say just a very brief word on training. Staff are legally expected to be trained commensurate with their work activities. So all staff in the food business need to have a basic understanding of food hygiene. And then the person responsible for the overall food safety management system would need to have had training of some kind in the principles of Hassub. And then just a recap on Hassub and GHP. Personally, I think of the Hassub principles in kind of more in simple terms in three ways. It's applying the principles are about what could go wrong, how can I prevent it, and make sure I'm doing it. And it's really about putting extra attention and resources on the things that are critically important to ensuring the food is safe. So at the critical control points. Whereas the GHP, the Good Hygienic Practice and the Prerequisite programs, they provide the foundation because in truth, the majority of hazards are controlled by implementing good hygienic practice. So there's one other element that at European level is highlighted in this guidance that kind of helps form a foundation to your food safety management system. I'll just note included in the references we'll be sending you is this European Commission guidance. It's Commission Notice C278. Some of you might be familiar with that reference. And in this diagram, it highlights that having procedures for traceability and recall in place are very important in terms of being prepared if something does go wrong. The reference is the principles of food law legislation, Regulation 178 of 2002. And in terms of traceability, what that means is you have to be able to go one step back and one step forward, back to your suppliers and forward to your customers. Of course, you don't have to go forward to the final consumer if that's the customer, but where you're supplying to another business. And the details you're obliged to keep, the name and address of suppliers, details of the products supplied, and the date of transactions. And for certain foods, for example, sprouted seeds and foods of animal origins, there are some additional requirements, but these are the basic requirements. With those other foods, it's an additional level of detail needs to be captured. Just to say a word that some larger businesses do choose to have process traceability, but it's entirely a business decision. But for example, if you receive a batch of an ingredient and you keep track of what batches of food you included that in, then if you find that there's a problem with that particular batch of food, you know exactly, with that particular batch of ingredients, you know exactly which batch of your own foods you would need to take action on. And in terms of taking action, businesses are required to withdraw unsafe food and notify the competent authorities when they're doing that, and when they've discovered an issue and have found unsafe food. And then when it comes to the consumer, businesses are obliged to inform the consumer of the reason for withdrawing the food, and if necessary, recall from consumers products already supplied to them when other measures are not sufficient to achieve a high level of health protection. And additionally, a business is legally obliged to cooperate both with other food businesses who may have supplied you, or the competent authorities who may be issuing food alert. Okay, so going back to good hygienic practice and the Hassub-based procedures, to give you the reference for the legislation, when it comes to hygiene, the main piece of legislation which applies to all food businesses is Regulation 852 of 2004. Additionally, there are rules specifically for foods of animal origin, and I suppose we're all more aware of the zoonosis concept with the pandemic recently. So, animals can be, looking at our foodborne outbreak data across Europe, animal foods are still the greatest source of foodborne outbreaks, but foods of non-animal origin aren't free from risk either. But this is why legislation exists for foods of animal origin additionally, because of the bigger risk. And then it's within Regulation 852 that the Hassub requirement is contained. So I mentioned flexibility in the legislation, and really what this flexibility is about, or takes into consideration, is the nature and size of a business. So there's a big difference between a corner shop that has no deli counter and is storing maybe some yogurts and prepackaged sandwiches in a fridge, along with juices and soft drinks and so on. There's a big difference between that kind of premises and a catering establishment or a large manufacturer. And so the ways in which the flexibility is recognised in the legislation is to say, in fact, that in some businesses, just by the nature of what's happening in that business, good hygienic practice alone is sufficient to control all those hazards. So you do the hazard analysis, you identify that the hazards in your business are controlled by good hygienic practice. So for example, you're maintaining the cold chain in that corner shop example. The legislation also recognises that there are some sectors where there's a commonality in the activities they do, and therefore that sector can get together and produce a guide where the majority of hazards where the hazards are identified and controls have been identified. But just to caution you or remind you that it's still a business's responsibility to control all the hazards in its business. So if a guide only covers a certain amount of what you do in your business, you still need to apply the principles of Hassub yourself for the activities not covered by the guide. And then, of course, anybody can do the full application of the 7 principles of Hassub, but even there, there's a degree of flexibility in how they can be applied. So, for example, Classically, the 7 principles come from Codex Alimentarius, the international food standards body. And its guidance suggests that you should gather a team together to develop, to apply the principles of Hassub and develop your food safety management system. Clearly, in a small operation, that team might just be one person. So that's just an example there. We all struggle to get past the blank page. And so these national guides are extremely helpful. Within Ireland, historically, the National Standards Authority of Ireland has facilitated production of guides with the relevant stakeholders, so the catering sector themselves, and then the regulators, the environmental health officers in this case, and the Food Safety Authority were involved in writing these, agreeing these standards. Additionally, there's a standard for retailing and wholesaling. There's one for bottled water manufacturers. And then there's a general manufacturer's guide, which is currently under review with NSAI. FSAI, I suppose, looked at what was available and maybe where gaps existed. And while NSAI has a safe catering, or has a hygiene in the catering sector guide, the feedback we were getting from environmental health officers and from some businesses was that they were struggling to follow a standard, and I suppose they needed maybe more plain language and more visual aids and maybe more prompts. So we developed the Safe Catering Pack as a project in conjunction with the Food Standard Agency in Northern Ireland, and I'll say more about that later. We've also developed a workbook style document for farmhouse cheesemakers, and that was again in conjunction with cheesemakers. The fresh produce safety in primary production in Ireland is another guide, and then we have a guide for slaughterhouses. And then additionally, there's a wealth of guidance available at European level. There's this food hygiene guidance platform, and Emma has included links to these. So we all register our national guides to good hygienic practice here, and then European guidance is available here. And then community guides that have been developed by community, European community trade associations are available in this link. And then some of the food safety authorities' booklets and fact sheets are available under this national guidance. So a few words on the Safe Catering Pack. For those of you not familiar with the pack, this is just an extract to show you what the tables look like. And specifically, what I want to point out here is that what we've tried to use is plain language, but we've also linked into the wording used in the Hassub principles. I will say for some people, they prefer not to mix monitoring and verification, given, as I said earlier, some people get confused about what the difference between monitoring and verification. But we have feedback from the users of this. We found that it worked well by doing it in this way. And then for each step in the guide, we have an advice section with tips and guidance and also some visual prompts. Some of you may be aware that the Safe Catering Pack was updated in 2019, and it was based on feedback from a survey of caterers and environmental health officers. And the other reason for updating it was we felt it was time to include allergen management in the main pack itself. Those of you who may have the old pack, allergens were dealt with in the other sections, the additional information, and we felt it kind of was lost there. So allergens has now moved into the main tables section. And we've also included a section on acrylamide. So for people who have the old pack, we've made these new sections available free on our website. One of the other changes we made to the pack was to alter this step, or this page, where effectively we have a kind of a flow chart of sorts, identifying the steps in a typical catering business. We've highlighted here that most of these steps here, these steps here all consider microbiological hazards. And it's only down here that we deal with the physical and chemical hazards. Down here we deal with the general physical and chemical hazards. And as I mentioned, we deal with allergens separately. And in fact, we've also dealt with acrylamide sort of as a fifth hazard, if you will. Okay, So then moving on, just to give you a flavour of what's in the allergen section, I suppose one of the main things we've done here is to make people aware that they really need to read the advice section first, which deals with advice on how to declare and manage allergens. And then the advice on acrylamide. So sorry, I didn't, for those of you who may not be so familiar with acrylamide, I should have explained it sooner. It's a chemical that naturally forms in baked or fried starchy foods. So for example, chips and bread. So those of us who like our burnt toast or our very well done chips, I suppose are increasing our risk to exposure to this chemical. And acrylamide basically is a substance that can increase your risk of developing cancer. I suppose the main difference really with a lot of the chemical hazards is that it's exposure over time, and then it's not just exposure from food, because chemical hazards can exist in other places, not just in the food we eat, but they could be in anything from toothpaste to, not acrylamide now, but just in general chemical hazards. So I suppose we find that food businesses aren't so good at thinking about chemical hazards as they are about thinking about microbiological hazards. And part of that, I suppose, is hygiene has traditionally been very focused on controlling microorganisms. So we just want to sort of make people think, you know, what other chemical hazards could there be in their business? I mean, I suppose one that really in all businesses, if you are cleaning, and so, for example, in a catering establishment, if you're cleaning near uncovered food, and nowadays we use a lot of sprays just to make sure that the food is covered before you're spraying, to make sure the cleaning chemicals don't get into the food. So just to finish, going back to acrylamide, there's the tables on acrylamide, as before, as with the other sections. So in the last few slides here, I'm going to cover some tips. I've mentioned if you're using a guide to good practice, you must check if all the steps and activities in your business are covered, or do you need to go and do your own hazard analysis? And I really do reiterate that. One of the other things actually that's included now in the Safe Catering Pack, we have an other step, and it used to be left blank, and there's still a blank table there for you to fill in yourself. But we've given an example of advice on sushi. So there was quite an increase in sushi businesses over the last number of years. And so that was an activity that we've described how, you know, in the additional advice, how you go about controlling it, but we've left it up to you to fill in the other step. So in the Safe Catering Pack, we do have that other step there to prompt you to fill in when something is not covered by the pack. So for example, outdoor catering is another thing that might be happening in a typical catering business. Okay, going back to the tips, I suppose we all get audited in this day and age, and often a lot of paperwork is produced for auditors and inspectors, but really in a food business, you aren't taking food safety seriously unless your food safety management system is your document and not just a document to display to your inspector. Legally, you're obliged to periodically check that your system is up to date, and especially if you've made a change in your business, it's the first thing you need to think about. You could be introducing new equipment, for example, or changing a menu. You could be introducing a new allergen. If you change supplier, you need to constantly be checking. And then some more tips. Don't be afraid to record things when they go wrong. In fact, if nothing has gone wrong, if the records look like everything is okay, to be honest, your inspector is going to be suspicious. In real life, things go wrong, and what's more important is not what went wrong, but what you actually did about it. And then a lot of businesses decide they want the comfort of having external expertise, and they decide to employ a consultant. And we would just say, in terms of buyer beware, what we're really saying here is choose a consultant that knows your business. There may be consultants who are more generalists in terms of the principles of Hassub, but really, if you could get a consultant who understands the business you're involved in, that really is much better. And the other thing that's important when you do employ a consultant, they're not going to be there in the business all the time. You and your staff need to own your own food safety management system. So even if it's written by somebody else, you still need to really understand it and own it and make sure you're implementing it. Some of you may have been asked by your customers to have a quality management system in place. And the only purpose of this slide is to say to you that that is not a legal requirement, and it's something between you and your customer's specification for doing business with you. A very brief slide to let you know that the hygiene legislation was updated this year. It has now includes reference to allergen management, although very little detail on it in the legislation itself. It has requirements around introducing food safety culture into a business. And at the moment, the European Commission is working on guidance on what that might look like. But there's enough text in there already for businesses to start thinking about how they can do that in their own businesses. And then the legislation also includes requirements around food donation, and we have guidance on food donation available on the Food Safety Authority's website, and that's also included in the links of resources that we will circulate later today. So then maybe just to let you know in terms of some changes that have happened, I've mentioned Codex Alimentarius, and it's the document, the general principles of food hygiene, which includes the Hassub principles, which is the globally agreed document on Hassub. It was updated in 2020. And then the International Standard Organization has this food safety management standard many of you are aware of, and it was updated in 2018. So cognizant of those updates, particularly those two documents, and of course the change in the hygiene legislation this year, the European Commission has already started a review of its guidance on food safety management systems. And then some of you who might be interested in kind of reading in more detail, the European Food Safety Authority issued two opinions on doing hazard analysis in small retail type establishments like greengrocers, ice cream suppliers, and fish mongers, and so on. And so, and one of the things that's interesting about those documents is how they use the Commission's document and integrate it with the EFSA scientific opinion. Okay, so to conclude, what we've covered today is the principal hazards, the principal hazard categories that you find in food businesses. And we've seen that when it comes to allergens, many businesses do treat it as a fourth hazard. And then the key to controlling these food hazards, having a Hassub-based procedures, having a foundation of good hygienic practice, and being prepared, making sure you have a traceability in place and you have a system to withdraw and recall unsafe food. Okay, and then broadly, if you want any more information, our website has a lot of resources that I've mentioned, and we'll be including links to many of those in the links this afternoon. But please go to our website as well. For example, we haven't included anything on training, so if you want to find out more on training, please go to the website. And you can, of course, subscribe to our food alerts, allergen alerts, news and events, and of course, send queries directly to us. Okay, so ready for questions and answers, if anybody has any questions. So, Emma.
Great, thanks very much, Lisa, for a really educational session on managing food safety in your business. Some really great tips there at the end. So we've a good few questions coming in here now. I'll pick out a few. So the first one here is there a common guide for home production?
We do have guidance on domestic production on our website. So actually, Emma, I can maybe include that. It's not on the list that we produced, but I can send that to you later. So yes, we do have, there is guidance on that. And I suppose maybe the other thing to say is, you know, it can be feasible depending on what you're doing to do it safely in a kitchen, but something in a domestic setting, some things are feasible and others aren't. And really, I would advise talking to your local environmental health officer before embarking on that to make sure you're doing it safely and legally.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And we'll try and share that link in the chat before the end if we can. If not, we'll pop it in the email later. So the next question, and I know this has come up a few times, especially on our advice line, is there such thing as a Hassub certificate?
No, I mean, maybe people can issue it, but legally there's no requirement to have one. So, I mean, you know, if a business is being asked by their supplier for their evidence of how they're controlling food safety in a business, maybe they have decided, as I said earlier, to go and have a third-party certification quality management system put in place. But in terms of the law, and I suppose that's what we're more interested in, you know, what you do in business terms, that's a different matter. But legally, there's no requirement to have a Hassub certificate. And we certainly don't issue one. And the environmental health officers or the Department of Agriculture inspectors or the local authority inspectors, Sea Fishery Protection Authority, none of those agencies who operate under contract to us along the food chain would issue a Hassub cert.
Thanks, Lisa. That's great. Another one here. Is there a need for internal audits?
So, I mean, I suppose internal audits are verification, an element or a tool you can use for verification, depending on your business. I mean, internal audit sounds off-putting maybe, but actually, you know, it's about going and checking that you're following your procedures. You've something written down, are you actually doing it? So while I think maybe it sounds bigger than potentially it might be in a small business, in a larger business, obviously it's a larger task because there's more paperwork and there's more staff and potentially more processes. But yes, so I mean, I would say internal audit is really a verification tool. So it's one of the 7 Hassub principles.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Emma.
I have another one here. It's just a little longer, so just bear with me for a second. So we're going to open a zero waste shop where we will sell loose dry foods from specially designed dispensers. We're finding it very difficult to get any guidance on how to design a Hassub system for a business. We will need to comply with the guidance for the catering industry in many aspects, even though we will not have a kitchen or sell any raw or cooked foods. Our retail part doesn't fit into the retail category as such. Sorry, hold on 2 seconds. And sorry, the rest isn't coming up for me here.
Okay.
Also, they don't have any catering experience, and we've completed Hassub level 1 and 2 and allergy awareness training.
Okay.
So they're just looking for guidance in this area.
So it's loose, dry foods that will be dispensed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lisa, if you want to even take a look at this one afterwards, I can send that on if you prefer to answer it that way.
I think it might be better to answer that by email. I mean,
I think so. There's probably a little bit more to it.
Yeah. The retail standard from FSAI may be useful to help, because you are talking about a retail business.
Yeah.
I suppose that the key thing I'd say to you is, you know, any business that's purchasing food to which they do nothing else to, you know, they're relying on the safety of that food. They're relying on their suppliers to ensure the safety of that food. So what's critical there is having suppliers you can trust. I think that's probably one of the key things. And as you mentioned in the question, for sure, you'll need to be aware of providing accurate allergen information. And then depending on the foods and how they're stored and so on, you know, can you guarantee there won't be any cross-contamination between certain foods that might contain allergens to foods that don't contain the allergens? So I suppose certainly allergen management is going to be very important where you have a dispensing situation. And I would say with loose dry foods, you know, are those foods, have they just been dried or were they previously cooked? We do know that dry foods can contain salmonella. So you would want to be sure that your supplier had strong controls in place. A lot of dried foods, you know, don't have a high enough heating step to destroy microorganisms. But again, without more detail about what the foods actually are, it's difficult to say anymore.
Okay, that's perfectly. So we can address that afterwards as well. That'd be brilliant. Thank you. So another question here. We probably have time for just one, maybe a second one, and then we'll have to pop off. But this one is: do you offer online training for food safety officers?
for food safety officers. I presume they mean in a business as opposed to environmental health officers, or
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't offer the training, but we have a number of resources available on our website to show you how you can go about either getting training or training yourself, and in which it's allowed for in the legislation to train yourself. Really, the important thing about training is to be able to demonstrate you have the knowledge. So whether you self-learn or whether you actually go on a course, what's really important is that you actually retain the information and you're applying it. But go to our website for guidance on that, is what I'd suggest. Okay, Emma?
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. And I think we've time for just one more. So can you explain the term operational prerequisite programs?
Okay, yeah, I suppose every sector is very good at coming up with new terminology. The source of this is the International Standards Organization, ISO 22000 standard. And really what it is it's good hygienic practice that requires extra attention. And in fact, in the update to the Codex Alimentarius document in 2020, they decided to describe this term exactly in that way, good hygienic practice that requires extra attention. Those of us, I suppose, who are very familiar with the Hassub theory and the debates about when is something truly a critical control point, or when is it a place where control needs to be applied, but it's not genuinely a critical control point, we'll realize that it's when you can't truly eliminate a hazard to an acceptable level, or eliminate or reduce to an acceptable level, but you can actually reduce. That's a place really, I suppose, where you have a control measure that could be described as an operational PRP or as good hygienic practice requiring extra attention. As I said, the source of that is the ISO 22000, but in fact, the European Commission has adopted the terminology OPRP, and in its update is considering continuing to use it. But we have found, I know the National Standards Authority group working on the update of the manufacturer's hygiene guide decided that they would keep things simple and decided they didn't want to include that. So in some places you may start to see this use of these terms, good hygienic practice requiring extra attention and operational PRPs, but in other guides you'll probably just see hazards that need to be controlled and the places you need to control them, without trying to make the differentiation between that. I hope I answered that question. Sorry, I probably went on a little bit there, but yeah.
Not at all. That's really useful, Lisa. Thanks for going into detail on that as well. So, look, I suppose that's it for today. And apologies to those of you who sent questions in that we didn't get to answer. But you can email your question to info@fsai.ie and we'll get back to you. So thanks so much for taking the time to tune in this morning. And just a couple of things before we say goodbye. We're going to host another breakfast bite on the 24th of June, and it's on the legal position of cannabis-based food products like CBD oils in the EU and Ireland. So as I said, it's going to take place on the 24th of June. Registration is just open this morning and you can register via the link Elaine has just shared in the chat box. Thanks, Elaine. And we run a number of free events for small food businesses throughout the year, just in case you weren't aware. And you can subscribe to our event alerts, fsai.ie/subscribe. And again, the link is in the chat. And you'll receive a notification as soon as registration opens for all of our events. So after this, a survey will launch and we'd really appreciate your feedback. It'll help us create future events suited to your needs. And thanks so much to Lisa, and also a huge thanks to Elaine, Jane and Mary behind the scenes. And thank you all for joining us. Take care.